Hello, I'm GC mckay, and today we're going to be having a discussion about Jean-Paul Sartre's Nausea, known in the original French as La Nausea. Wanker. As I believe it was Marilyn Manson once said, no matter how far you run, you cannot outrun your cliche. Anyway, cheers. Yeah. This has been requested for a while, actually. So it's good to finally dig into it. It was a bit of a tricky one to read straight after the Book of Disquiet, but there you go. I kind of knew that going in. I'd read it before anyway, so I already had a kind of preconceived idea of what I was getting into. But it had been a number of years, probably at least 5, and I really enjoyed it actually this time around, despite the angst and existential crisis that it provoked. That is kind of, par for the course with this novel, and obviously going by the title, you kind of know what to expect going into it, I suppose. It was first published in 1938, so very close to around the time that The Stranger was first published as well. But I will point out here that often The Stranger by Albert Camus and Nausea by Jean-Paul Sartre are kind of proffered up as a kind of companion piece to each other, that you should read them back to back. And although that they do kind of dive into similar elements, I wouldn't really say that the two are that largely connected. That's a personal opinion, but I think that is demonstrated via the structure, the sentence wordage quite a lot of the time, the plot, where, for instance, with The Stranger, we have a much stronger plot-based novel despite its philosophical context underneath everything. Whereas with Nausea, there isn't really one overall, I wouldn't say. It's a character study more than it is a plot-driven piece. So in that regard, I would say that the two are quite separate. And I don't really want to say I prefer one over the other. I do think one has definitely been more influential, and that would be The Stranger overall. I think it has stood the test of time a little better, but I think that is largely due to its kind of universal element. If you have no idea what existentialism is, that won't matter when you go into The Stranger because of the structure and the way that the story is told. You'll still be able to have an opinion on it. Although many people have the wrong opinion of that book, I've noticed. Some people label it as a kind of crime novel, which is totally off the mark. It's not. Although it does feature a crime within it. The Stranger is not a crime novel. But I don't want to go too much on about this. And I would say that, though, to make a last point, that The Stranger doesn't have a word in it that isn't needed. It's very, very concise in the way that it's told. I would venture to say it's much shorter. I'm pretty sure it is. Although Nausea isn't really that long either. And I don't think I could say the same for Nausea overall. But I wouldn't really say that would negate from what it's trying to say and what it conveys. And in a way, the superfluidity of the novel is actually important and needed. And that word superfluidity or superfluous is featured throughout. There's a kind of section in it where our protagonist, Anton Mcquinton, is discussing the superfluidity of everything around him, of existence in general, and of its superfluous nature, of how, for instance, a tree that I can see now outside there's such an abundance, a voluminous amount of them out there in the world that kind of just exist for the sake of existing. It never asked to exist, it's just there. He kind of starts to see everything around him within this superfluous nature. Him of himself at some points as well, he kind of sees as a superfluous being. Everything about him, his essence, even through death, through a suicide that he imagines would be superfluous as well. So that's just a small section that we kind of hit around the middle point. To get onto the story, or the attempt at a story, I would say. Anton Mcquinton is a 30-year-old male who walks the streets of Beauville, which is a made-up place. It's quite similar to Le Havre or Le Havre. I'm going to get pronunciations wrong as always. And it kind of loosely translates as Mudville. So it's this kind of place. I mean, it's similar to your typical kind of cities, I suppose, especially of the era. So it has all the local kind of amenities, cafes, pubs, everything kind of within walking distance, rivers and, all these kind of things that you can go and travel and explore, all within a quite, close vicinity to each other. And this Mcquinton guy is a 30-year-old, if I haven't said that already. He's an historian by trade, and he is working on a book about an 18th century diplomat called Rebellion. And really, that's about it. Like, that's all you really know at the beginning, at least, anyway. He does have an ex-lover who he's in contact with, who we learn of quite early on, so we kind of expect her to kind of turn up at some point. She goes by the name of Annie, and she's an English actress, or at least was one anyway, and she is a former lover of Mcquinton's, and they've still kind of kept in contact, and they meet from time to time, but it has been about 4 years or 5 years since they've seen each other now. And she comes into the story later on, and we have an autodidact, however you say that fucking word, a self-taught person, and he's kind of friendly with Mcquinton, but it's not really a mutual thing. Mcquinton, like much of the other things around him, he finds him a little bit disagreeable, shall we say. He's not really sure on the guy. He observes him more than he kind of engages in conversations with him, though later on they do actually have a kind of a meal together, and they have a kind of a discussion. And really, as Mcquinton is working on this historical book, it kind of really nicely parallels the experience that he's going through at this moment in his life. He's by his own admission, he is a traveller who has seen many places of the world. Hanoi, Shanghai, Genova, everywhere, basically. And I question that overall. I'm not really sure I buy it, because he's been to a lot of places, and the only real evidence he has for it are through postcards. I think some photographs that the autodidact actually does come by to actually see them at some point, for his own amusement or entertainment or whatever. And that's it, really. We get a few asides where he talks about his ventures in particular places in the East, for instance. And I wasn't sure how much I was supposed to believe that overall. I don't think that was the sole unreliable piece in the novel, but it was something that seemed to stick out a lot this time around. And I think it was more because it makes it seem like he's more interesting than he really is, in a way. And for somebody who's only 30 to have travelled that far, it's something didn't add up, because he wasn't exactly a rich man. He's kind of like, he's able to get by on, I assume, some kind of royalty, or maybe an advance payment for the book he's writing, but really he isn't somebody who can just, you know, venture the amount that he claims. But anyway, that's just a kind of personal insight, I suppose, I had over it. And I think it was intentional. I think it's supposed to give you this kind of disparaging kind of element where everything feels a bit disconnected, though it is connected. And I think that was linked quite strongly with what, existentially speaking, our protagonist goes throughout the piece. And to go back to the parallel, he's writing this kind of historical piece and talking about this, you know, diplomat from the 18th century. And he kind of seems to grow more and more distant from his own past whilst he's diving into the history of this person's. And what he finds is, because he's got all of these like stolen texts about the man, he finds too many contradictions going on throughout. So again, I do think that plays into Mcquinton's own contradictions of what he claims to have, or the places he claims to have travelled, you know, and all of these kind of things. I think everything was kind of mixed up in this equilibrium of doubt and disbelief, essentially. And I enjoyed that a lot more this time around. I think the first time I read it, I wasn't quite clued up as to what that was trying to represent. But as we hit the middle point, about the time he visits a museum at some point, and he's looking at similar figures, the paintings of the era. And I remember the first time I read it, I thought that section dragged too much. But this time around, I actually found it quite easy to get through. I don't know whether that was something to do with reading the Book of Disquiet, which is easily double the length of this, and having a bit more patience, or maybe because I've been reading, you know, so much over the last few years that I kind of naturally can just kind of go through books and not really, you know, get too tied up in it being too long. If you go through books of old, Dostoevsky, Dumas, they were writers of a century that actually paid them per line, so you can understand why they would be overly garrulous with their prose at times. I do find it grating from time to time, but with that knowledge, I do find it easier, and you can have more patience for it. Plus, reading at that time was the main entertainment medium, so I think indulging in it rather than trying to be concise is perfectly understandable, and it's a shame we're kind of losing that. But then again, we're kind of losing all compunction to read in general, so, you know, at least we still have books for now. And it is after this museum trip that I started to really feel what Sartre was saying via the voice of Mcquinton, and how he will look at certain objects and start to basically see the complete absurdity of everything, of how human beings have constructed all of these ideas. So to take an item such as a hammer, to us it exists as just a hammer. It is a tool that can obviously hold things into walls or whatever and make sure that they stay structured. But really, outside of the human element of it, of labeling things with names and with kind of attributes of its usefulness, it is really just an item, and that's it. It exists, and really all the names and everything and labels that we put on it are just our construction and our way of trying to understand a universe that is essentially incomprehensible, and something that really is quite absurd overall. Like, he starts to and he starts to dive deeper and deeper into this. I related to it especially because I find myself in quite a similar position to Mcquinton, especially these days. I'm not close with my family. I don't have any friends, and I basically wander around from time to time. Not as much as this dude, because I'm okay in my little cave of a room, but I will go outside to read, for instance, now, because I have to get out of here because I'm going fucking mental. And I'm kind of like, I mean, that's what I found difficult at times was reading this, because I feel the isolation. There's quite a few moments where I'll be in the park reading through something and I'll look up and I just see people together being humans, socializing, getting along, playing games, walking their dogs. And I'm the only motherfucker there, reading for one, and on his own. Usually, like, it's rare for me to see another person doing the same as I am, which is fucking sad. But at the same time, it is sad for myself as well as a general concept. But yeah, it made it something that I could easily empathize with, but I was slightly reluctant of doing, especially considering the material involved and the feeling of not really existing and of feeling forgotten long before you're even dead. There is a kind of element of that goes into it as well, which I think all of us kind of feel at some time or at some point. And those of you who don't, I probably will never speak to about anything of any significance, because unless you see the absurdity of everything at some point, or at least feel the nausea that Sartre talks about, which to describe as a feeling is it's almost like an overwhelming moment where you realize how engulfing everything can be, and how superfluous, as he talks about, but also of how everything is really just connected to each other. Existence precedes essence is a quote from Sartre, saying that everything exists. Existence comes before everything else. So we kind of have to grasp onto that. But like Mcquinton does, probably my favourite section is when he's at a park and he's kind of staring. And this is just before he has this moment of hysteria, which I really like, where he's just kind of in a panic-induced kind of fit, almost, where he's kind of railing against everything, but in this futile manner, where it's kind of almost nonsensical, but at the same time totally relatable, where it's just like the madness that is coming out. But he's sitting in this park and he's looking at this chestnut tree, and he feels like he is the roots of this tree. Despite being separate, he is made up of the same elements and particles and whatnot. So it's almost like he's kind of getting a vision. He describes it as something is unveiled before his eyes and he can see it. But he is of it at the same time. So it's it kind of, for him to try and comprehend all of this is very dilapidating to his psyche, which it naturally is. And I do think that whenever people have these kind of moments, I mean, I probably have one once a week. They do get easier, but there is a kind of level of overwhelmingness to existence that kind of swallows you up and leaves you for dead. And in essence, you kind of just have to get on with it in a way. And I suppose that is Mcquinton's search, if we're going to go for the hero's journey kind of outlook, where he's really trying to find a way of being in a world that has no reason for being. So it's the kind of, it kind of comes down to the typical human condition, or the dilemma of the human condition, especially in a world that has left behind religion and the belief in God, which is what Mcquinton finds himself in. There are other elements to it where it is talking about the sociological element of the time, the impact, of course, of not only World War One, but the upcoming World War Two, with it being in 1938. It must have been lingering in the atmosphere kind of thing. The rise of Marxism, socialism, which gets a kind of a mention at some point. You could say Marxism is discussed, but I wouldn't say it's for or against, regardless of Sartre's own leanings aside. It is just kind of put out there. The autodidact actually mentions that he is a socialist at some point, as if that means anything. To McQuinton, that's just like, humanism comes up actually as a discussion. And McQuinton finds it completely absurd, and doesn't really go along with it at all. He kind of thinks it's all bullshit, essentially, which he kind of considers everything. Like, there's moments where he just rails and he's just like, of course it doesn't fucking exist, and all this kind of thing. And he's just kind of like essentially going insane. I think, as mentioned before, because of his isolation and his complete solitude, it isn't just his own sanity he's trying to keep hold of. It's kind of his whole meaning as well, and his whole reason for just getting up. I would imagine that, say he were to visit a psychologist or a psychiatrist, they would probably diagnose him with severe depression, maybe dissociative disorder of a sort. But really, I just think he's going through a natural human crisis, which is essentially what existentialism was all about trying to find a way to navigate in a world that essentially has no significance whatsoever. And those are the kind of main subjects it talks about. Towards the end, we do have I would say, a conclusion that is mostly positive overall, though I don't know whether I found it necessarily that positive. I think it was definitely something that Sartre came to a realization with himself, and he put it through the lens of McQuinton, especially due to the fact that he is a writer as well, and in his own personal life, Sartre was known to write ridiculous amounts. I think something like 12 pages a day. So he really dedicated his life to taking action, essentially. And by creating your own existences, let's say, because there's a song that is often referenced throughout, but that's sung by a black woman and written by a Jewish man. And he has this kind of moment of epiphany, let's say, where the justification for existing without ever having asked for it can be kind of justified by making something else exist that can be heard or felt. And it wouldn't be if it wasn't for your creation of it. So essentially, creation or existence, creation makes further creation. So if you can make something outside of yourself to exist, then maybe there's some solace to be had in that. I mean, overall, I suppose it would seem to be a positive outlook to it, but I kind of question that as well. I'm not sure it's necessarily that great. But, I mean, because it is a form of sublimation. And to get onto that point, quite a bit of the novel did remind me of Ligotti, actually, reading it. There's moments, and especially of the kind of Lovecraftian element, where this unveiling of existence and of being is like a horror, essentially. It's like what he kind of comes to realize is that because everything is interconnected, there almost seems to be something that works outside of the atmosphere that is like Schopenhauer's like life force. So there's something that works, and existence has this kind of need almost, or force about it that keeps going. And it really did remind me of a lot of horror pieces that I've read, and it made it quite an interesting read. And there were moments where I really felt this surge of panic that is rife throughout, especially towards the latter third of the novel, where he's he's losing the plot completely, but it's because he can feel and sense and starts to realize the nature of all existences, or of the whole being of existence. And that's what makes it a very fascinating piece to read. I did enjoy it a lot more this time around. And I'm not sure I should have done, really, because there were moments where I think it did make me slightly depressed and dissociative of myself. But I certainly found it very relatable, and I enjoyed it a lot more for that reason, most likely. But it had a kind of element to it where even where I did feel there was a superfluidity to the writing, it was forgivable because that was the nature of the beast at hand. And the overwhelmingness of existence is kind of exemplified via that kind of medium, I would say, overall. And it made it a fascinating read. But saying that, I need to read something a bit more, I don't know, plot driven after these last two. They've been they've been great to indulge in, and I do think now is actually a great time to try and dive into these kind of pieces, because we are in an existential moment of contemplation, I would say. We are looking at a world that has changed drastically, that has limited our options, and that has forced us to kind of confront our place in it. And I don't really need a pandemic to make me, start to consider that. But it is interesting to consider when everyone around you has kind of been slapped with the same stick, or apparently anyway. Whenever I'm out there, to some people it doesn't seem to be affecting them at all. So who knows? But the questions that it arises, and of course, I mean, it's one of the novels of existentialism, so you kind of have to dive in. If you're interested in the list that I've gone through so far, mostly speaking, this is surprising I haven't featured this book already, to be honest. But yeah, I enjoyed it thoroughly this time, if I haven't already made that clear. So let me know what you think of it. What parts did I miss, or perhaps missed? I'm not sure. I'm kind of waffling now because I've gone over my limit, or my normal limit. So I'm going to go. Thank you very much for watching this. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think of Nausea by Jean-Paul Sartre down below. If you have any recommendations for further reading that haven't already been featured, I'd love to hear them. And yeah, thanks very much for watching. I'll see you next week. Bye. Au revoir.